Today, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the second of the 811 PRA New Staff Refresher Webinar Training Series. Today's webinar topic is unit identification. Just a couple of reminders. Everybody's line will be muted throughout this call. If you have questions, you can feel free to type them in anytime during the presentation through the question box. And if you prefer to ask your question verbally, you can use the raise your hand function at the end of the presentation. We'll have some time for questions, and we can unmute your individual line at that time. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Kate Moore of True Casa Consulting, who will be taking us through this presentation.
Thank you, Ellen. Welcome to the Section 811 Project Rental Assistance Program Unit Identification Webinar. My name is Kate Moore, and I work with the Technical Assistance Collaborative to provide technical assistance to grantees of the 811 PRA program. I will be facilitating today's webinar. The Technical Assistance Collaborative has been hired by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, to provide technical assistance for the 811 PRA program. This webinar will end promptly at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time because many of the participants on the call today will be having to get off of this webinar to enter a new webinar that's a meeting regarding peer-to-peer talking that will be facilitated by HUD. So we'll keep a close eye on the clock as we go along. So this webinar is the second of a series of webinars to provide new staff to the Section 811 PRA program targeted information about the program. This webinar is particularly targeted to state housing agency staff as they begin to implement the Section 811 PRA program and need to begin to identify units and find eligible multifamily properties. So let's review the agenda for today's webinar. First, we will review the new staff training series. Then we will review what makes a property eligible. Next, we will discuss the unit identification strategies, steps to executing a rental assistance contract and the use agreement. Finally, we will review how to meet but not exceed a target number of units. For those of you interested in learning more information about the 811 PRA program, we encourage you to visit the HUD Exchange 811 PRA website for additional training opportunities. For those who might not have participated in our last webinar regarding 811 PRA basics, I want to review some basic information. Let's start with some program terms you will hear. One is grantee, which is the state housing agency who was awarded the Section 811 PRA grant. The next is 811 PRA, sometimes referred to as 811, sometimes referred to as PRA, These are both shorthand for the Section 811 Project Rental Assistance Program. The 811 PRA program is a long-term project-based subsidized housing for extremely low-income people with disabilities. Funds were awarded to state housing agencies to administer the program in partnership with the State Services or Medicaid agency. So the Section 811 PRA program has been around long enough that some states have had staff turnover or other staff might be newly assigned to the 811 PRA program. This webinar series is designed to provide support for those new staff as well as other staff members who may want a refresher or an opportunity to learn more about the 811 PRA program. So all of these webinars that you see listed here will be available on the Section 811 PRA website on the HUD Exchange. The series includes 8 webinars. The first was 2 weeks ago and provided an overview of the basics of the 811 PRA program. The second is today and provides methods for identification of units for the program. The third webinar will focus on outreach to potential 811 tenants and review all of the steps of the program until a tenant moves into a unit. The fourth webinar focuses on ongoing daily responsibilities of the grantee, such as budget tracking and reporting. The fifth webinar will be by Blueprint Solutions and will dive deeper into HUD systems. The sixth webinar will discuss how the grantee can help owners meet their responsibilities. The seventh webinar will focus on supporting tenants to be successful. And the 8th webinar right now is open for discussion and interest of the participants. So now we'll discuss eligible properties. The 811 PRA program is project-based rental assistance for people with disabilities that is used in eligible multifamily properties. As discussed in our last webinar, the 811 PRA program is used in a multifamily property to bring down the cost of the rent to make it affordable to extremely low-income persons with disabilities. All grantees, which are state housing agencies, have been allocated a certain amount of funds from HUD to provide this project-based rental assistance in multifamily properties. One of the first steps of a new PRA program must take is to find eligible multifamily properties to place this project-based subsidy. As a project-based program, the 811 PRA funds will be tied to a property as opposed to tenant-based housing programs such as mobile tenant-based housing choice vouchers that are tied to the person. The multifamily property can be a new or existing property owned by a nonprofit, public, or private agency. The property must have at least 5 housing units. The funds to develop or construct the property is typically through the state housing agency, as we refer to as a grantee. Sources to construct the multifamily development can include low-income housing tax credits or other state or federal housing development funds. An important point to remember is that 811 PRA funds is not used for the development or construction of the multifamily property. There are some specific items to remember when a grantee is looking for appropriate multifamily housing, including which properties will not be eligible for 811 PRA program. Ineligible properties include those with existing units receiving any form of long-term, which means longer than 6 months, project-based operating housing subsidy within a 6-month period prior to receiving 811 PRA payments. It's important to note here that if a property has other units without project-based operating housing subsidy, that those units could be eligible for the 811 program. Ineligible properties also include properties with existing use restrictions for persons with disabilities, unless the 811 PRA funds are being used to support other units in the building without those restrictions. This means that units used for the 811 PRA program cannot have an existing use restriction already to serve people with disabilities. Finally, ineligible properties also include units with use agreements requiring housing for persons 62 or older. They would not be eligible to receive 811 PRA payments. The 811 PRA program requires participants to be at least 18 years old and under the age of 62 at the time of entry into the program. A property can have some age-restricted or senior housing requirements, but on units, if they agree to accept 811, they can have to accept PRA tenants of any age for those 811 units. The integration requirement is an important element of the 811 PRA program because it ensures that 811 PRA tenants live in community-based housing that is not exclusively for people with disabilities. The 811 PRA statute says that no more than 25% of the total units in the property can be restricted to supportive housing for persons with disabilities or have any occupancy preference or use restriction for persons with disabilities. This means that the 811 PRA program could not be in more than 25% of the units, but it also means that any units that have a restriction to house people with disabilities will also count towards the 25% integration requirement. For instance, your community might have an existing multifamily development that has 100 units. This means that up to 25 of those units can have an occupancy preference for people with disabilities. Some other common programs that a multifamily property might participate in that would also reserve units for people with disabilities include the HUD Continuum of Care program and state-funded rental assistance programs targeted to particular disability populations. So once you've determined that your property meets the multifamily property eligibility and integration requirements, the next step is to familiarize yourself with the cross-cutting federal requirements that impact the 811 PRA program. We will not review any of these in detail today, but are important for each grantee to understand. Many grantees have created screening tools to help ensure compliance with these regulations. The Technical Assistance Collaborative has created a website that allows grantees to share resources with each other called the Share Site. This is a good place to find examples of grantee screening tools. So the federal requirements to familiarize yourself with include Davis-Bacon. So Davis-Bacon requires that contractors and subcontractors must pay their laborers and mechanics employed under the contract no less than the locally prevailing wages and fringe benefits for corresponding work on similar projects in the area. It also includes energy and water conservation. So you must ensure that the new construction properties meet energy and water conservation requirements. It includes lead paint requirements. So for properties originally constructed before 1978, the grantee must ensure that they meet lead safety guidelines. It includes fair housing and civil rights requirements. So the property must follow all fair housing and civil rights requirements, which includes some construction accessibility requirements, as well as non-discrimination requirements and affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements. The Uniform Relocation Act applies to 811. So if 811 has been awarded to a property that is rehabilitating an existing property with tenants, the grantee must follow the guidelines of the Uniform Relocation Act to ensure that the existing tenants are provided support during the rehabilitation. Accessibility. So all new construction and substantial rehabs properties must meet the following accessibility requirements. These accessible requirements are not reserved specifically for the these accessible units are not reserved specifically for the 811 PRA tenants, but must be part of the property. So 5% of the total units of the entire property must be accessible to persons with mobility disabilities, and 2% of the total units of the entire property must be accessible to persons with hearing or visual disabilities. So other Section 504 requirements for the property will be covered in a future webinar, Webinar 6, Helping Owners Meet Their Responsibilities. So grantees are required to conduct environmental reviews of both new and existing properties. The guidelines for the environmental review are found in the PRA guidelines located in the cooperative agreement. For existing properties, however, if the property is HUD assisted or HUD insured and will not engage in activities with physical impacts or changes beyond routine maintenance activities or minimal repairs, are not required to comply with the environmental tenets. HUD has created a webinar that goes in depth regarding the environmental review requirements of the program, and you can visit and view that webinar on the link on this slide, which is on the 811 PRA website on the HUD Exchange. So HUD regulations can differ in the program for existing versus new construction and rehab. 811 PRA units can be committed to a property that will be newly constructed or rehabbed. An example of this would be if a newly awarded low-income housing tax credit property received extra points in their competitive low-income housing tax credit application because they agreed to participate in the 811 program. Once awarded low-income housing tax credits, the property will need to be constructed, which can take about 2 years. Once constructed, the owner would agree to set aside a certain number of units for participation in the 811 PRA program. For existing properties, an owner may have a portfolio of properties that have received a variety of public subsidy for construction. They agree to place a certain number of 811 PRA units in their existing property. This typically requires properties to have vacancies due to turnover to begin renting to 811 PRA tenants. So this chart demonstrates some of the differences of how HUD regulations impact those two different scenarios. For example, Davis-Bacon, which is a requirement during construction that contractors and subcontractors pay prevailing wages, is a requirement for new construction and rehabilitation, but is not a requirement for existing properties. The Uniform Relocation Act only applies to rehabbed properties because tenants will not be displaced from 811 PRA as applied to an existing property. For lead-based paint requirements, it only applies if a property is rehabilitating a pre-1978 property. So there are floodplain requirements for both new and existing properties. If you have any concerns about any of these regulations, grantees are encouraged to bring those concerns to their tax technical assistant lead's attention. So next, we'll discuss unit identification strategies. So this is how are you going to find those units? So as discussed in the earlier slide, grantees can place 811 PRA units in either existing housing or new construction. Grantees have found that both have their advantages and disadvantages. This includes for existing housing, a grantee must wait for unit turnover to place an 811 PRA tenant into a unit. This can take many months and even years for enough vacancies to occur to fill all of the 811 PRA units. For new construction properties, at initial lease up, the 811 units will be immediately available. The construction of properties takes years to complete, causing a waiting period for units to become available. New construction units may be in nicer, newer properties, depending on the available stock of existing properties. Regardless if a grantee places units in existing or new properties, the properties must meet eligibility requirements. Eligible properties must charge allowable rents that are specified in a contract between the grantee, which is the state housing agency, and the property owner. The 811 PRA tenant will pay approximately 30% of their income to the property as their rent payment, which is typically much less than the property generally charges in rent. The 811 PRA grant pays for the difference between what the PRA tenant can afford in rent and what the property charges in rent according to the contract. So let's walk through a scenario. For instance, a property might charge $1,000 for a 2-bedroom unit. The 811 PRA tenant whose sole source of income is SSI could afford to pay $200 in rent. The 811 PRA program pays $800 in that scenario to the owner to make up the difference between the $1,000 rent level for the 2-bedroom unit and the $200 that is paid in rent by the tenant. Some grantees made additional commitments in their application to HUD. So this is their original application in response to the Notice of Funding Availability to HUD, to set their contract rents at a lower rent level than required in order to receive leveraging points. This allows the program to serve more 811 PRA tenants because the rents are cheaper. If your state made that commitment in their original application for funding to HUD, they must keep those leveraging commitments unless they receive a waiver from HUD. If you're unsure if your state has made this leveraging commitment, contact your tax TA provider. Regardless of any leveraging commitments, rents in the contract between the property and the grantee cannot exceed fair market rent as determined by HUD. An exception to this would be if a grantee can justify charging higher rents according to the 811 PRA requirements found in PRA.207. When looking for a property to participate in the program, ensure that the contract rents can meet the requirements of your PRA program. Other considerations include if a property is familiar with HUD systems, especially the TRAC system, which is a fairly complex HUD system required for tracking household characteristics, including household income, and it's used for requesting 811 PRA payments. If a property does not have familiarity with HUD systems, it's possible that the property management company that they work with does have that expertise and can assist the property to meet those additional requirements. So there's no one right way to find properties to participate in the 811 PRA program. Each state will need to find methods that work for them, but some typical methods include using a notice of funding availability or request for proposal, or NOFA or RFP for short, to solicit properties to participate in the program. This typically will ask for existing properties who are interested in participating in the program. The 811 PRA program does not have obvious incentives for participation for some owners, so attracting a volume of properties using this method might be challenging. Many grantees are tying their programs to the low-income housing tax credit program through offering points or set-asides or requiring a threshold for participating in the program with their property. The application, so it's in the housing tax credit application, and they have to, or perhaps they have to identify an existing property in their housing tax credit application to bring into the program. Some grantees are also identifying pipeline properties, which means properties that are under construction and receive financing from previous housing tax credit awards. Some grantees are also using outreach to owners and property management firms to encourage them to participate in the program. This can include one-on-one outreach regarding the program, as well as presentations to development and apartment associations, and presentations and networking at housing conferences. What's important to remember is that there's no one right way to do this, that each state will likely have to use multiple strategies to acquire enough units, and that you will probably need and be prepared to make mid-course adjustments. So you need to ensure that whatever units you select and bring into a contract, it will be filled in a timely manner by persons of your target population. The units must be desirable to the target population. And here is where your relationship between the state housing agency and the state service agency is critical. The state service agency will have insight into the variables that make units desirable and easier to lease up. You can only hold your partners accountable if you allow them to help define which units will work. Variables which state human service agencies have indicated are important to consider include location, unit sizes, accessibility features, and access to public transportation. So you definitely want to consider those elements and have conversations with your state health and human service partner agencies to discuss those. So if you're just now as a state starting to identify multifamily properties, determine what process you're going to use to include your partner agency's feedback and unit selection. So now that you have your units selected, you've determined that they're eligible, you've worked with your state human service partner to make sure that they're going to work for their target population. Now you need to execute a rental assistance contract. So a rental assistance contract is the contract between the state housing agency or the grantee and the property or the owner. So sometimes the rental assistance contract is called the RAC. The steps to the RAC are outlined here. They include requesting and receiving a RAC number from HUD, executing, which really means like signing the RAC and the use agreement, recording the use agreement according to local requirements. So this is, every state has a little bit different local requirements of how to record those, so you need to follow your own state laws. You need to send a copy of the RAC and the rent schedule form to HUD, and there's a RAC checklist that's been developed that will help you to know which elements to include. And also important to remember that after you've executed all those RAC elements and before you start to receive tenant referrals, you need to approve the property tenant selection plan. That's part of the grantee responsibilities. So if you're interested in learning more about the steps to executing a rental assistance contract, TAC is holding a separate webinar dedicated just about this on January 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this information should have been sent out to all the grantees, but if you are not familiar with this webinar and are interested in participating, be sure to contact your TAC TA lead and we can get you that information. So each grantee was awarded a certain amount of funding, not a guaranteed number of 811 PRA units. So now that you have all of your steps to a RAC and you know what you need to do to move forward with that, you need to think about the next step, which is projecting grant expenditures. So grantees are responsible for tracking their grant expenditures to make sure they do not under or overspend their grant amount. This requires close planning for the number of units in a RAC and monitoring RAC expenditures closely. Each RAC that is executed is expected to have 5 years of funding. As properties begin participating in the program, each RAC will have different start dates. After 5 years, the property will be eligible for continued funding, but will be subject to future appropriations. So over time, based on actual expenditures of the program, grantees may need to adjust the number of units in a RAC. An important part of this planning is to understand the fund disbursement and leasing deadlines of the program. For FY12 grantees, for instance, all funds must be dispersed, which means used, by September 30th, 2025. In order for that to happen, all 811 PRA units must be in a RAC and leased by September 30th, 2020. So the dates are 1 year later for fiscal year 2013 grantees, as you can see on this chart. So in order to determine the number of units in a RAC needed to meet those HUD deadlines, grantees should create a tool to track expenditures over time. These tools should begin with some assumptions. So this could include total tenant payment. So this would assume a rent payment of your target population. Perhaps for your state, that's a percentage of the Social Security SSI payment in your state. It should look at changes in contract rent. So you probably can assume an annual increase of rent based on the rent adjustment methodology used by your program. You should look at changes in utility assistance. So update with any changes to utility allowance amounts over time. So after lease up, using this grant expenditure tool, projections should be updated by actual expenditures to keep projections accurate. Over time, depending on actual expenditures, RACs may need to be amended with more or fewer units to reach the targeted grant expenditure. So that's all of my slides, but now I want to introduce a staff member from Texas who is administering the Section 811 PRA program there. So Texas received 811 PRA funds in both the fiscal year 12 and fiscal year 13 rounds and has done a significant amount of work identifying units for participation in this program. So I've asked Spencer Duran, who is the Section 811 PRA manager in Texas at the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, and he has graciously agreed to help us answer questions, and we're hoping to have more of a peer-to-peer discussion regarding this topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up his phone line now. So Spencer, are you on the line?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Spencer. So we also have Ellen Fertack who led off the webinar, and she is going to read questions that those of you who have put them into the webinar, she's going to read those to us, and she can also help us if you've raised your hand and have a question as well. So Ellen, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we've got a few to start off with. So the first is, what happens if a property decides that they no longer want to adhere to their contract and they don't want to participate in 811?
So part of what happens, well, it depends on what stage they're in. So if you've already executed a RAC and a use agreement, they have to meet their obligations of the program if the grantee wants them to meet those obligations, is the short answer. One of the reasons that the program has the use agreement is that it records the obligations of the property participating in the 811 PRA program, even if the property sells, because it's recorded with the property legally. So that doesn't mean that there's never an instance where a property would never sign a RAC and then not participate in the future. But that the way the program is designed is that it's a lot more up to the grantee or the state housing agency than it is up to the property. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Spencer.
That's essentially it. I think that if it was in the program's interest to let a property off the hook, if a property is underutilized or is generating zero interest from the target population, I understand that you can keep the use agreement recorded, but then through the RAC, do a RAC amendment to bring the RAC down to 0 units. That would essentially make it dormant, but it would not ultimately wash off the use agreement.
All right. Do we have anything else, Ellen?
Yeah, we've got another question in. Somebody is wondering where they would find the 811 PRA tenant selection plan.
So, I'm sorry, what was that last part, Ellen?
For their state, I'm guessing.
Okay, for their state. So there's 2 levels really of tenant selection plans in the 811 PRA program. So each state, the grantee, the state housing agency, has to develop a tenant selection plan for the program, and that's a program-wide one. So it would have elements such as how the waiting list is going to be handled for the 811 units in that state. If there's any prioritization of target population, that type of thing. But in addition to that, each property has a tenant selection plan that has to be approved by the grantee, and that's a property-specific tenant selection plan. So if you're looking for the grantee or the state level one, you need to contact your state 811 PRA program. I think a lot of states have placed theirs on their website, but if they haven't, they should be able to get you a copy of one. I'm not sure if that answers your question, if that was really your question. Let us know if that didn't. And I don't know, Spencer, if you have anything to add to that.
We've got a follow-up question here. Just asking if the global tenant selection plan is part of the cooperative agreement. So
no, the tenant selection plan is not part of the cooperative agreement. So the cooperative agreement is something that it's a special kind of contract that is required from HUD, and it's a contract between the state housing agency or the grantee and HUD, and it outlines a lot of the requirements and the elements of the program. But the grantee develops that after execution of the cooperative agreement, and that's not part of that. I'm not sure if that answered it as well. But if you're from a state, you definitely, if you have a lot of questions, if you're a grantee, I'm not sure what your role is, but if you're a grantee, you could definitely, or with the state service agency, you can talk with, every state has a assigned technical assistance lead from TAC, and you can talk through that and learn a little bit more about those requirements as well.
Thanks, Kate. It looks like we've got one more question coming in. Well, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Oh, yeah, okay. So somebody is looking for more information on what to look for on the tenant selection plan from the properties.
You know what? I'm going to let Spencer take the first stab at that because they have done a lot of that in Texas.
Yeah, there's a chapter, I think it might be a whole chapter, if not a portion of a chapter, in the HUD Handbook 4350.3. There is essentially an exhibit or a chapter, I can't remember which, but there's a really straightforward checklist, and it mentions everything that has to be in there. So it has some required language, some recommended language, and then it spells out how you have to articulate the credit, criminal, rental criteria, and things like that. There is also the HUD notice that accompanies the program, and I think that also informs the tenant selection criteria. And then also, I think that you should look at the program guidelines, because a lot of the grantee requirements need to be translated or transferred over to the property. So there is the program guidelines. I think it's Exhibit 5 of the cooperative agreement. It spells out the grantee obligations and the property obligations. Under the grantee obligations, there's a lot of stuff that a grantee is not going to actually be able to do. So they need to transfer some of that responsibility over to the property. And by doing so, that should live in a property's tenant selection plan. There's also Violence Against Women Act, there's fair housing language, but I think that some of those tools can really help you as you review and approve those tenant selection plans.
Thanks, Spencer. We've got another question here from somebody wondering if you have any ideas around ways to market the program to existing apartment complexes.
Well, Spencer, I'm not sure if you have anything on that. I don't know if you felt like you've had to market since many of your units have come into the program via the housing tax credit program. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Well, really, I think that your biggest tool as a state housing finance agency is, either points or threshold in the qualified allocation plan. If you incentivize a developer or make a developer do something, then they're going to do it. So Kate's right. We haven't had to do any marketing because going back to 2015, we've either had 811 in there as a point or a threshold item. I think you can do a lot to decrease resistance to the program. For example, a lot of our participating owners, thought that they had to leave a unit vacant for 6 months, and that's not true. They thought that they could only charge the 30% tax credit rents, but we pay up to the 60% tax credit rent. So I think that creating a frequently asked questions document, conducting webinars, creating a web page that is targeted to owners can make them feel more comfortable with the program. But ultimately, the power is obviously with the money via the QAP.
I can add to that I know that some states have had success at acquiring properties outside of the housing tax credit program. as we talked about in the webinar, you're unlikely to get a huge amount of volume with that method, but some states don't have large programs. So Texas got the largest amount of money 2 years in a row, so they need to get hundreds and hundreds of units on board. And so that's one of the reasons they've hitched their wagon to the housing tax credit program, because that's what's going to get them that. Some states are hoping to bring on 40 units or 60 units, and having a networking with existing owners might be able to get them those units, maybe not. So I think Spencer had some really good ideas about making sure that people understand the program and understand what the requirements are. FAQs are great. Some states that I've seen have worked their relationship, so they might have meetings one-on-one with properties. They might make presentations at housing conferences and talk to a large number of property owners at one time. They may call for a roundtable kind of meeting to just kind of educate interested developers and about the program so they can get to know it and see if they're interested in participating. Some states have had very formal notices of funding availability, or NOFAs, or requests for proposals, and have been successful at acquiring properties that way. And so we can, if you're interested in learning about those, definitely contact your technical TA provider, and they can kind of connect you with peers that have done similar things, so they can kind of show you what they've done and perhaps tell you what worked and what didn't work. Okay. Any other questions out there, Ellen?
It looks like we don't have any more written questions right now. Just a reminder, if you prefer to ask your question verbally, you can use the raise your hand option and I can unmute your line.
Well, while we're waiting, I want to take advantage that we have Spencer on the line. So Spencer, I thought that you talked about this, but maybe you could sort of just talk about it more generally. So how have you been getting units through the QAP? Folks might be interested in that if they're thinking about using their tax credit program to acquire units.
So using the tax credit program, we've had, way before 811, we had what they call a special needs point item, and so we added a few options under that pre-existing special needs point item. And in Texas, our approach was to try and first recruit pre-existing properties, because if you look at the Texas tax credit portfolio, especially in the last few years, it was a pretty suburbanized portfolio. And so while we could have, recruited a lot of new construction or rehab properties through the tax credit program, a lot of those properties that were seeking funding were in pretty suburbanized areas, and we wanted to incentivize pre-existing properties for a few reasons, but one of the reasons was because they're generally located in more transit-rich areas, or they have more neighborhood amenities. Maybe they have established sidewalk networks and things like that. So we wanted to incentivize pre-existing properties. So going back 2015, 2016, and 2017, we've essentially first asked developers to give us a pre-existing property, and then if they didn't own any pre-existing properties that fit our criteria, then they could give us that property or commit that property that's actually applying for the tax credit points. But also to prevent properties from giving us their lowest performing property in their portfolio, we worked with advocates and our Health and Human Services partners to establish some basic criteria for those pre-existing properties. For example, a pre-existing property had to have an occupancy rate of 85% or better. It had to have an inspection score like a REAC or UPCS score of 80 or above. And it had to be funded from TDHCA no earlier than 2002. We were just trying to get, newer properties that were high performing. Whenever you recruit pre-existing properties, though, there's a problem because those units, once you sign a RAC, and you could commit, 25 units, but those units are going to be occupied by pre-existing tenants. So there is a give and take. You're going to have to wait a long time for those units to turn over, but you don't have to wait for construction. So it's just kind of a balancing act to figure out which is going to lease up faster.
Thank you, Spencer. Do we have any other questions come in, Ellen?
No, we don't.
All right. Well, sounds like that we might be done. I would encourage states that to reach out to their tax TA leads as they start to think about unit identification and more questions come up. Because there's definitely a lot of resources out there. We can connect folks with peer-to-peer states so that they can learn from each other. One of the nice things is the program's been around a couple of years now, and so we often can find you somebody who has been doing something that's unit identification in a way perhaps that you're interested in, and we can connect you together. Also, I'd encourage you to access, if you don't know how to yet, the tax share site. So that's a great website where peers, states can share materials that they've been creating. And there's a lot of unit identification materials on that share site. So definitely find that. If you don't know where that is, ask your tax TA lead, and that can get you that link on the TAC website. But that's all we have for today. So as a reminder, in 2 weeks, we're going to have the next webinar. So the next webinar is about looking at the steps between outreach and move-in of a tenant. And we hope you participate in that one as well. So thank you so much for everybody for your participation today. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Kate.